Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The State of Trade, How Will the U.S. Midterms Affect Global Trade? Nobody else was talking about midterms. We thought we can be the ones. We can take this on. Before we begin, though, a few procedural points. At the end of this session, we'll hold a Q&A, time permitting. You can ask questions through the Q&A function on the right of your screen. Your questions are only going to be visible to you and the Flexport team. We'll share a copy of the slide deck also at the end of the presentation. All right. And now the parts that makes our lawyers happy. Please keep in mind that all information provided in this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. All right, now, who are we and what are we going to talk about? I'm Phil Levy, I'm Chief Economist at Flexport, and I have a couple of outstanding guests with me today to talk about this. So let me introduce each of them in turn. We've got Mike Smart with us. He is a managing director at Rock Creek Global Advisors, an international economic policy advisory firm. He focuses on international trade and investment policy there, including market access and regulatory matters. He advises multinational companies, financial institutions, trade associations on ongoing international trade and investment negotiations. He's done all kinds of impressive things. Let me name just a couple of them. He previously served as International Trade Counsel on the Democratic staff of the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance. One of the things we'll be talking about today is how potent some of those roles are. But in that role, he advised Chairman Max Baucus of Montana and members of the committee on a whole range of trade matters, including WTO negotiations, dispute settlement, free trade agreements, agricultural trade, and trade aspects of climate change. He has also served as Director for International Trade and Investment on the staff of the National Security Council at the White House. So, Michael, welcome back. It's great to have you with us again.
Thanks so much, Phil. Nice to be here.
And then we are also thrilled, making his State of Trade debut, to have Darien Flowers with us. Darien is our new head of government relations here at Flexport. He leads the company's strategic engagement with the public sector. Both of them are in Washington, unlike me, I'm sitting out in California. Darien is a veteran of Capitol Hill and the Commerce Committee, I believe, and the executive branch. Yes, it was the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and he was in the policy office at Transportation. So, Darien, thank you for joining us.
Oh, pleasure to be here, Phil. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's get to what we're going to talk about today. So it seemed when we thought about all this that like a week would be, yeah, that's enough time to figure out what's happened in elections. So we set the date for the session. We planned the election to be a week earlier. It didn't work out exactly the way we thought. We still have uncertainty about the results for both the House and the Senate. We'll get to that. So our first section is going to be what just happened, what are we talking about? The second section is where we make life really hard for ourselves and we pull out our microscope and we try to find out what did the discussion we had in an election tell us about public sentiment on trade? Maybe not as prominent as it was in some past elections, but we'll see if we can find something. The third section, we're going to talk about what the likely agenda is. So now that we've gotten down sort of the players and the majorities and the committees and the structures, what might they do and what won't they do? What would they like to do? And we're also going to come at this from, suppose you really cared about trade, and we do, what are some things you might like to see happen and how do we handicap those things? Then we're going to close by talking about where does this all headed? That as you know, usually you think of an election as sort of setting a course for a country, or maybe at least heading us to the next election, and also a bit how is the rest of the world going to react to this, and what is this going to mean for broader global politics? So that's our agenda. That's what we're getting into. As is our custom here, we're going to start though by asking what you all are thinking. So we're going to do a warm-up question and find out what you think. So you can see the poll on the right-hand side of the screen, and here's what we're asking you is the first is we'll do several of them during the hour. But on U.S. economic policy broadly, do you think that the 2022 midterm elections will, and here are your choices, bring more market-oriented policies, bring less market-oriented policies, not make much difference in practice, or I don't know, I'm just glad the ads have stopped. We actually have a substantial number who are just glad the ads have stopped right now. But maybe you can weigh in on this and see whether you're sensing a direction or whether you see stasis or It's all up in the air, and that's why you came here, so that we can sort this out for you. Thank you, everyone who has voted. Let me give a moment or two more for you all to register your opinions. It seems at the moment we have a pretty clear leader, which is this isn't going to make much difference in practice. Which, on the one hand, predicting gridlock in Washington is not that daring a bet. On the other, we may well have a significant change that we'll get to in the next section. All right. So, Darien, if you had to pick on this, I'm going to put you on the spot, just like everybody else got put on the spot. What would you be clicking, or did you just click?
So, I would say is that even though I work in politics professionally, I say is that I'm with the 20% of our attendees here that I'm just glad the ad. In all seriousness, though, I agree with the 52% is that predicting gridlock in Washington is a safe bet. However, I am cautiously optimistic. While in the traditional definition of trade policy, thinking about things like free trade agreements, Section 301, things like that, anti-dumping, countervailing duties legislation, while those are still very much in the TBD category, I think if anything in Washington, you're seeing an expanded definition of what trade policy actually is and what the things that policymakers are willing to discuss in the broader context of trade. That's industrial policy, the idea of just national security policy in the context of great power competition. But then you're also seeing things that are kind of subcategories of traditional trade policy, like customs policy and customs enablement. I think there's actually going to be a continued engagement from both the Hill and the administration on those three things. Oh, and export controls.
So we'll come to all of that. That's an excellent preview of where we're headed. But you okay, that you hedged a bit. You're supposed to press one button. It's good, but
I did hedge, right?
You get a lot of chance to clarify. Michael, where are you on this?
Yeah, I voted for bring less market-oriented policies, and I did that really with a long view, because I think one way to look at this is, maybe we reached peak trade in the early 2000s, and then you just have a series of kind of economic and political disruptions that have really caused a bunch of other issues to kind of come onto the scene more, starting with the financial crisis, the rise of China, the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine. I think what all of it means is that, economic security, industrial policy, human rights, social objectives, I think all of this has come in, that governments have enacted measures in these areas that are pretty bipartisan, and I see likely as continuing. So I base my vote not on the fact that Republicans are likely to take control of the House, but really because it's a product of a much longer trend that I see as more or less bipartisan.
Okay, well, that's depressing, but compelling also. So, all right, let's thank you all for participating. Thank you to my guests. Let's get to what actually happened, and we'll delve into some of these details. So we're going to start with a slide that is outdated a little bit as soon as we put it up, the next one, where, all right, what was the vote? So just to take stock, we've got, when last I checked, the Democrats have at least 50 votes in the Senate, which withholding, given that they hold the White House, means that they are in charge there. And we have to still see about a runoff in Georgia. For the House, when I did the slide on Sunday, you get the nice pie chart, but the lower left gives the latest numbers, at least according to what I've seen, which is you've got Republicans with 217 called elections in their favor, Democrats with 205. That means that there's 13 out there. Basically, Democrats would have to take every single one of those remaining 13 to block Republicans from taking control of the House. Michael, I want to start with you on this. As sort of experienced Washington hand, as somebody who's actually been through power transitions on Capitol Hill, what does this all mean? Let's just assume for the sake of discussion, although it's not solidified yet, that Republicans will take control of the House, that they'll get at least one of those 13 remaining. What is that going to mean? What does that mean for committees, for staff, for all the things that sort of set policy?
Yeah, so in really basic terms, what it means is that the Republicans will control the gavel. They'll chair all of the committees if this outcome holds, as predicted on this slide here. So that means the ratio of all the committees has to be adjusted to reflect that Republican majority in the House. It also means that the budgets for each of those committees are also adjusted to reflect the change in majority control. Now, in the past, based on these changes in control, sometimes the majority party would pad those majorities in the committees, in their budgets, and so it would result in some pretty significant changes. I think that's less likely to happen here. We're now realizing that change of control happens more often than it used to. So you might be on the losing end in one election, but the winning end in another. And so I think there is kind of less of a desire to kind of take advantage of that situation. I'm told, for example, that staffing on the Ways and Means Committee, at least on the trade front, won't change. So you won't have Democratic staffers, for example, losing their jobs because they're now likely to be in the minority party next year. But by controlling those committees, the chairman then gets to set the agenda, which means both kind of oversight and legislation. We can talk more later about the likelihood of being able to enact legislation, but the oversight component will be really important of the various trade programs and other issues that we've mentioned.
No, that's very helpful. Darien, let me ask you. So I think Michael was referring to sort of budget and who's on the staff. What does this matter? Who is the? I know we've had some of you playing this role, but what does it matter? Who's the lead staff? Is it the chairmanship of a committee that matters? Is it the members of a committee who matter? Is it the lead staffer? What do the cognoscenti look for?
So I'll tell you is that being in the majority, as Michael mentioned, means that you get to set the agenda. And so while the majorities in both the Senate and the House will be very slim, it's still a custom on Capitol Hill is that whoever the chair is of a committee is the person navigating that group of members of Congress or senators through the waters of their committee's jurisdiction. What this means practically, and for those who may not understand kind of how congressional staffing works, is that there are 535 members of Congress, 435 members of the House, and 100 senators. Each of them have staff that represent their constituent interests, whether it be their state or their respective districts. However, in addition to that, on the policy side, there are committee staff, those of which both Michael and I were committee staff. The committee staff are subject matter experts who are really designed to help the respective chair or ranking members, so the top member of the minority party, navigate policy through that committee's jurisdiction. So committee staff, when you see these kind of significant pieces of legislation coming through, whether it be USMCA or other trade policy or customs policy, the part that you see on C-SPAN where it's receiving a hearing or going to the floor is just the tip of the iceberg. And that's really the last bit when the members themselves get involved. The other 90% of like the mass of an iceberg is done by the staff, and in a lot of times with these large, significant pieces of legislation by the committee staff. And so having those folks understand trade issues, understanding the policy priorities of various stakeholders is key to success because they're the ones doing the actual work.
Oh, that's very helpful. Michael, let me ask you, you're welcome to agree or disagree with that, but I also wanted to ask you, how much do margins matter, both either at sort of the committee level or for the governance? Like, for example, in the Senate, does it matter whether the Democrats have 50 or 51 seats, given that they've got the tiebreaker with Vice President Harris? And on committees, is it just simply control, or do margins matter?
Oh, margins definitely matter because the smaller the margin, the more the chairman or the majority leader has to aim for the middle with kind of their legislative agenda, because obviously with a 50-50 division, you can't afford even to lose one vote. I like how someone summarized what is at stake in the election in Georgia, which if the Democrats win, the Democratic incumbent wins, would give the Democrats 51 votes. He said, in that event, it's the Democrats who have the majority. If the race goes the other way and Herschel Walker wins, then it's once again Joe Manchin who is in the majority. It's just highlighting the influence of any single senator in an evenly divided Senate. That's the same is true at the committee level as you look to consider, mark up, and approve legislation. The same dynamic is at play, where every single member on the majority side of the dais controls the fate of the legislation, if that's what's required to get legislation through and onto the floor. So margins are very important.
Let me sort of push you on this a little bit. Does that make for a more centrist or bipartisan agenda because you're sort of compelled to pick up votes from the other side?
I think it's situation specific. I think in the Senate it will tend to have that effect. How it affects the House, I think, is very much up for debate because if it's Kevin McCarthy who is the next speaker, he will have an enormously difficult job bringing forward legislation that satisfies the very strong contingent of conservative members, while at the same time not making the relatively smaller number of moderates who've been elected too uncomfortable. And so, I think there it's risky to underestimate the influence of kind of the more conservative right, the members who were aligned with former President Trump in setting the agenda there, and I think there'll just be a lot of pressure on the more centrist or moderate members to go along with that program.
Let's move to the next slide. This is a perfect segue. And Darien, you've got this all sorted out, right? What's going to happen in the House and who's going to be in charge of everything. Yeah. So you can just fill us in. We'll stipulate, just for the sake of argument, that Republicans get to at least 218 votes. What do you see happening? And you can go right on down from who's holding the speaker's gavel to key committees, if you have thoughts on it. I realize this is all speculative.
No, of course. So understanding, the framing lens here of assuming that Republicans take control, it's understanding who will be the GOP leader. The process is beginning today, where Republicans will be holding the first step of their leadership elections. And so, for those who don't understand, is that or may not be aware, it's kind of for the party that is in the majority in the House, right? It's kind of a two-step, right? They have to have their internal discussion amongst their conference, so the group of Republican members in this case, and then in order to actually elect a speaker, then this is the House procedure sets out a process to actually elect that person on the floor of the House. So the Republicans are starting the internal part now, where Kevin McCarthy will be nominated. He will also have a challenge from the right, from a very conservative Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona. All indications point that Speaker McCarthy will at least get the nomination of his party for Speaker. However, the real work is done on the floor in that second bit, where he actually has to come up with 218 votes. And right now, reports are talking about that he is facing defections within his conference that would prevent him from doing that. I am still optimistic that he comes to get the gavel as Speaker, but the question will be is he willing, or how many concessions is he willing to make, or really coalitions is he willing to form to get to the second bit in order to get the Speaker's gavel? When talking about those conditions, it means is that for the Speaker, or the person who's looking to become Speaker, it's just like anything in politics. You've got to form coalitions and create an environment where you have folks who are willing to be on your side, respectively, support you. But then also it's a two-way street, right? Making sure that they are rewarded for their loyalty. That means that in the House, at least for the respective conferences, that means in selecting the chairman, in this case, for the respective committees, and when we're talking about ways and means, it is it is not the traditional selection process that folks might be familiar with, where it's purely based on seniority. The Republicans use a concept used called the steering committee, which factors in a lot of inputs, seniority being one of them, but it's actually an election. Now, the uniqueness here, where it's not a pure party, whoever gets the most of votes, because on the steering committee, the speaker in this case actually gets 4 votes. And so going back to this kind of coalition, Speaker McCarthy will be in a situation in this case of, if one of the 3 Republicans, Vern Buchanan of Florida, Adrian Smith, and Jason Smith, who are running for the Ways and Means gavel, can bring him the kind of coalition necessary to secure his speakership, that will likely then mean that he's willing to form a coalition around them to give that one of those 3 folks the coveted Ways and Means gavelship. In terms of,
this is a week in Washington of heavy politicking internally.
Absolutely.
Okay.
In terms of Speaker Pelosi, this is the real wild card. If Democrats had the night that we had thought that they were going to have, it is a scenario that everyone expected that this would be the time that then Speaker Pelosi would have, bowed out from her leadership in the Democratic conference, and that there would be a changing of the guard amongst them. However, that didn't happen with Democrats overperforming. Now things are very much a question mark, and you've seen reporting over the weekend where the speaker now says that even if going to the minority, because of the strong performance that Democrats had, members are asking Speaker Pelosi to stay on as minority leader, and that really throws a wrench into the passing of the baton that everyone thought would happen.
Well, let me turn to Michael there as a veteran of that side of the aisle. All right, Michael, they're asking Speaker Pelosi to stay, but with the somewhat less appealing role of minority leader as opposed to being Speaker of the House. What does she say?
Yeah, that's what we're all waiting to hear, right? And it's not just members, but it's the President of the United States that apparently has asked her to stay on as well. I mean, being in the minority in the House is in general, a pretty woeful existence if you define success as having significant influence over the development of legislation. It can have very important roles politically, messaging, keeping members together. And it does have the possibility of being more influential when the chamber is so evenly divided. So it's not kind of the usual calculation that she might have, if she was operating at a deficit of 25 or 35 or 40 seats. There is much more influence here, much more at stake. Is it enough for her to stay on for another term as leader of the party? Only she knows that, and I expect we'll hear in the next few days.
So that was my next question, is the timeline for this. Is there the new Congress doesn't actually come in until January. When do these things have to be decided?
Yeah. Well, the Democrats, I don't know the precise schedule for their election, but unlike McCarthy, who needs to be elected only after the new Congress convenes, parties can name their individual leaders at any time. It's just a matter of their own party rules and setting that schedule.
And what is the tradition, and what have you seen in the past in terms of how quickly and what sets that tempo?
Yeah, you would see that over the next few weeks during the course of the lame duck sessions when all the members are back in town and available to meet and as you say, lobby other members to support them. I think in the case of Pelosi, it's entirely up to her if she decides to stay again. I wouldn't expect that she would face any opposition.
All right, thank you.
One thing on the schedule, there's reporting indicating that Speaker Pelosi now is going to delaying making any kind of decision until after the Thanksgiving holiday, and that there's also some reporting about that Democrats actually, even in the House, may delay their leadership elections until after the Georgia Senate runoff is determined, to really understand where all the dust is settled.
Oh, that's interesting. All right, why don't we close this out? Darren, did you want to say a word on we sort of have been throwing around Ways and Means and Finance.
Yes.
But first, we're throwing those committees around for a reason. So maybe you could say what that reason is, and what's going on with the Republicans on Senate Finance?
So the Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committee are the trade policy committees within the House and the Senate. The Ways and Means Committee, if I'm not mistaken, is the oldest committee in Congress. It was the first one that Congress ever created. And the Senate Finance Committee, in addition to handling all matters of trade policy, handles all things related to the tax code and by extension, healthcare policy. It is a highly coveted appointment to work to be appointed to the committee where Michael worked. The Senate Finance Committee is very prestigious, and because of retirements, Senate Republicans will have to replace likely 3, if not 4, members of their current makeup of the Finance Committee. Richard Burr of North Carolina is retiring. Rob Portman of Ohio is retiring. Ben Sass of Nebraska is resigning to become the president of the University of Florida, and then Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania also is retiring. So that's 4 coveted spots that, frankly, Leader McConnell will have to decide where does he put his members on, especially in this context of very, very slim majorities, as Michael talked about, is that the Republican leader on the Finance Committee, Mike Crapo of Idaho, will likely be looking for those who will be aligned with his policy priorities, because of the fact that moving anything through the committee will require a track towards at least a unified position amongst Republicans, if not towards the middle.
So, Michael, this is your old committee. You want the closing word on where it's headed?
No, I think Darien gave a good update. Chairman Wyden and Senator Crapo know each other well, work well together, and so coming back to what I said earlier about aiming for areas of potential compromise, I think the way the leadership is set up now, that it stands a good chance of happening.
Okay, great. Let's go on to our next topic, which is we've been sort of talking about who sets stuff on trade, but I want to sort of put you guys on the spot for how do we think of this as a gauge of public sentiment? That's usually what we think elections do. We often think they're doing that. They're telling us what the public thinks. And so if we can go to the next slide on this, I put a little picture to remind us on the right, which is once upon a time, and that this is around, 2016, we had trade issues really at the center of a lot of this. It was a big issue between where, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden were in the Democratic Party. It was certainly something that President Trump was very active on with TPP. I did not hear that kind of trade debate in this most recent election. Michael, let me start with you. Where did you see trade, or did you pick up anything about trade sentiment out of the election we just had?
Yeah, only as subtext, and nothing like the way trade was front and center back in 2016. The subtext, one would be China, as you have here on the slide. I don't think that cut to the significant advantage of either party to the extent it was an issue, and that's simply because there isn't much difference between the parties on policy toward China, whether policy coming out of the administration or through the legislative process. So could you see the outcome as the public essentially validating that shared position? I think you can, even if it's a little subliminal. The other area is certainly industrial policy. I think a lot of things explain the Democrats exceeding expectations in the election. But I think many of them felt quite good about the agenda that they were running on, of what was done during the current term of Congress, whether that is, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, or the latest, the Inflation Reduction Act with its investments on the climate and energy transition. I think that there were many candidates who ran on those issues did well, and so I think you can see that as an expression of support that in these strategic areas, the government needs to be more involved and committing more fiscal resources and paying more attention. So those would be the things that I would glean, maybe sort of reading the tea leaves as to what the public message was in this area.
That's a good way to tease things out. Hey, Darren, what did you take from this? Was there a mandate for anything in there?
I agree with actually Michael's, point at the beginning of the webinar, is that there's a uniqueness here where America does not feel particularly united on the political realm. The sentiment around a broad definition of trade actually might be one of the few things that Americans are united on, not in the context of things like TPP or trade agreements, but this idea of industrial policy could actually be an opportunity for greater cooperation, because it gets things that each side of the respective ideological spectrum want, right? The left likes the industrial policy for critical minerals to advance climate priorities and things like EVs, but then Republicans like it because it enables a hawkish posture towards near-peer adversaries like China and Russia. And so the uniqueness here is that you saw in the election members who were active, to Michael's point, in the discussions around these kind of key pieces of legislation like the CHIPS and Science Act be rewarded. One good example is Senator Todd Young from Indiana, handsomely reelected, and he was the Republican partner of Senator Schumer for the original Endless Frontiers Act that later became the CHIPS and Science Bill. So the voters rewarded those who were willing to engage on these areas of commonality when you saw people like Senator Young come back.
That's a good point. So, Michael, let me turn to you and pick up on Darien's point, which is we're interested in what the public thinks because it's a democracy and we care, but there's also the version of, can politicians claim a mandate and can this drive action? So, from what you were saying before, will that translate? Is that something where somebody can pick it up and say the voters have spoken and therefore pass my bill?
Yeah, I think you would be hard pressed to draw a connection, that's that direct. But again, I do think that particularly in the area of industrial policy, which is not trade per se, but it's just that the government needs to be more involved in promoting the competitiveness in key sectors. I think you can take this outcome and say, that position enjoys a significant degree of public support. The one other, and this is a little bit political, but one other thing I would say is that the fact that many of the highest profile Trump-endorsed candidates did not win, I think actually does create an opening for Republicans, if they choose to do so, to kind of return to their more pro-trade roots. It's not that the Trump-endorsed candidates lost because of Trump's views or their views on trade. I think that would be a hard connection to make. But it just creates the political space to move away from that position, again, towards something that was, historically more the case for many in the Republican Party.
Well, this all leads us very nicely to talking about the actual issues and the positions, which is where we're moving next. And as we get to that, we're going to come back to you, the audience, and we're going to hit you with another poll question, which is, if you could get Congress to act on trade, what topic would you most like them to take on? You got a lot of choice here because I didn't actually tell you what you had to make them do, but here are some options. Tariff removal. So we're thinking about things like Section 301 on China. Industrial policy, to do more on industrial policy. You actually could choose more or less, but do something on industrial policy. Facilitating free trade agreements, the kind of things we were just talking about, like TPP, but more practically, probably the question at hand would be trade promotion authority. What about an issue like customs modernization? That's a ringer. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Or you have the option of Congress should leave trade well enough alone. So let me give you a moment. I see we have a strong leader already with sort of tariff removal, but this is a bit of a choice to the stuff we've been talking about between conventional trade policy. Conventional trade policy, I think, would be more things like, does Congress set tariffs? or do they do free trade agreements? We'll come back to the topic later on. Actually, wait a second. Is it Congress that does that, or is it the White House that does that? But Congress, by the Constitution, actually does have a lot of authority there. So let's see where you all are. It's a lot, not as many enthusiasts for industrial policy here. We've got about a sixth of the people weighing in on customs modernization, and then a handful who said to leave this alone. All right. Thank you all for having voted on this. I think we do have the clear winner with tariff removal. I'm going to actually, you know what? Let's just start with that. Let's just take those top two as a way onto the agenda. We'll have them on a list later, but I'm going to ask both of my guests, to handicap: is Congress going to take a role in removing Section 301 tariffs or passing trade promotion authority? We'll take our top two finishers. Do we hold our breaths? Is that going to happen? Darien, why don't we start with you, and then Michael gets the last word on it.
I was actually going to say, I would say defer to Michael because he did this, right? He was the person in the room, at least for the Finance Committee, with Chairman Baucus. So I would defer to his expertise first.
All right, let's pass it to you, Michael. What do you say? Is these hopes going to be fulfilled?
Yeah, I think there's a decent chance, and I don't know. I'll put it at 51% in order not to completely fudge. But I would just go back to the vote on the trade title on the USICA bill. That was the China legislation that the Senate passed to get that ball rolling, which was approved overwhelmingly. 90 plus senators voted in favor of that trade title, which included very strong provisions to create a new process for businesses to apply for exclusions from Section 301 tariffs. So I think there is a decent chance that idea is revived. I think that that there's more and more analysis looking at the burden of these tariffs and saying, well, in some cases, this might have imposed more of a burden on China, but in many more cases, the burden was on U.S. manufacturers that rely on inputs from China, or U.S. consumers who are already facing escalating costs. So I think that has some of its own political momentum. And back to what I said earlier, if Republicans want to take this opportunity to create some space between themselves and President Trump, who imposed these tariffs in the first place, here would be an opportunity to do so. So that's what I would say about the Section 301 tariffs. On TPA and trade agreements, here I think this is incredibly important, but I am not terribly optimistic that in the next 2 years, either of these will see a lot of activity. I say it's important because I think we're going to come to realize that there is no way for us to effectively compete with China globally and particularly in Asia unless we are willing to engage in kind of comprehensive trade negotiations that really put on the table benefits not only for ourselves but for our trading partners. And so I kind of see that the way I see other issues where China is that lens that kind of sharpens the focus and can marshal support. And I think over the longer term, that's likely to happen. I just don't think it's going to be in the next 2 years.
Let me push you on that last bit, because you said comprehensive. Is that a code word for market access?
It is.
Okay, because that seems to be where the Biden administration has drawn a bit of a line. If you listen to USTR-CHI, they want to do things like the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum and others, which are talking about digital trade or the environmental issues, not the traditional meat and potatoes of a trade agreement, which is, are you cutting barriers? You're saying that that's necessary to include again.
I am, and I'm saying it's necessary even to accomplish those goals identified by the Biden administration itself. They've named really important issues. To what you said, I would add clean energy supply chains. What are we going to do to shift production of critical materials needed for clean energy out of China and to other locations? Well, you've got to put things on the table that create real incentives for companies to invest and to shift production. And that can involve a series of regulatory measures or standards, all important, but it also has to have kind of a market preference attached to it. And so in order to really draw our trading partners to the table, show them that there are benefits, and in order to be able to accomplish some of these things that the Biden administration itself have identified, I think it does have to have that market access piece as part of a broader agreement.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Well, we'll see if they're listening. Darien, I wanted to sort of pick up on something that Michael said, which is I presented some of these policy choices as binary, kind of. You take off the Section 301 tariffs. As Michael noted, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can have exclusions, for example, and you can have a more generous exclusion policy. As you look at these policy things, let's do that more sophisticated handicapping of Congress doesn't touch it. Congress goes bold and really reasserts itself, Article 1, Section 8, we govern these things. Or is it something in the middle where Congress tries to temper things and make constituencies happy without being too forward-leaning? What do you see, Darien?
So I'm actually, at least on the facilitating trade agreements part, I'm actually a little bit more bullish than Michael is, right? We're starting to see a little bit of forecasting right now, particularly on the Republican side in the House. Now, Congressman Vern Buchanan, one of the finalists to become chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which, as we described earlier, is the committee with principal jurisdiction over trade policy, has talked about that. He says, quote, "We need to get back on the field when it talks about trade deal making." And he says that that the committee overseeing trade policy should be, quote, "full tilt on reviving TPA." So that is that's kind of a going all the way up to 11 from the potential chairman there on this idea of facilitating trade agreements. I think where we actually end up landing is somewhere in the middle, right, where it's some combination of these things. Because I do acknowledge is that that's just one of the four principal actors on trade policy in the Congress, right? The chairman and ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee and the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee. I think, though, in that with the optimistic comments from Congressman Buchanan, you actually might see a scenario where you take some of that energy and it is transferred to a other loosely related vehicle, and it rides that way, the same way that folks had hoped to do for in the context of the Chips and Science China competition bill. That customs modernization legislation actually may become a vehicle for other trade priorities if an agreement can come together, right? So you take this kind of EPA DNA and put it into maybe a stronger host that then comes to fruition.
Oh, and I should just, in the role of being provider of footnotes, just say the reason we're talking about trade promotion authority is this is the legislation that Congress traditionally provides to the executive branch, which makes certain guarantees, sort of procedural guarantees, that lets them go and negotiate trade agreements, and that trade partners often look for. And among those guarantees being you won't filibuster it in the Senate, and it won't be subject to amendments. So often just seen as a prerequisite to having serious negotiations. Okay, end of footnote. Let's move on and take this stuff in sort of sequentially and ask what's likely going to be on the agenda. And let's start with our lame picture of a duck. As opposed to a lame duck, but close enough. So Darien, maybe you can start us off. You have Congress back right now. They're back in D.C. The people who were just elected aren't there yet.
No.
What do we expect to happen in the near term?
So I would say is that for those who aren't aware, the lame duck, portion of a Congress, and when I mean Congress, I mean the 2-year period that the United States Congress is sitting in Washington in session, where it's doing the public's business, considering legislation. When we talk about a Congress, they all have a number, and we are in the 117th Congress, but we are closing out that one, and the 118th Congress begins the first week of January. So just we kind of definition set for folks. We are in the lame duck period, which means the period after the election, but before the new Congress starts. And this is traditionally been a period where there could be a lot of deal making done via Congress because members feel traditionally unrestrained by the pressures of partisan politics because either they may have just lost or have already announced that they've retired, and so the opportunity for deal making can be done. Congress has a very, very long to-do list in this lame duck that are outside of the things that in this conversation we care about. However, there's a rather significant wild card category in that to-do list where things like addressing a potential national railroad strike that unfortunately looks like it is increasing in likelihood that it may happen because another one of the 12 national railroad bargaining units voted to reject the deal brokered by the administration prior to the election. And so unfortunately, I think we are trending towards a likelihood. Now, that's not traditional trade policy as we discussed, but obviously a work stoppage in the national railroad system would have great economic impacts and affect global trade. The law governing these topics ultimately gives Congress the option to address a work stoppage, and if things trend in that direction, Congress may be forced to act. And
I would note that as chairman of this discussion, I'm totally going to allow the inclusion of logistics in a discussion of trade.
Exactly. So that is a potential thing where Congress may not want to do something, but it may be actually forced to do something given the trajectory that we're headed. And then with trade policy, you're actually seeing optimistic or wishful thinking by some members of the Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee to address some of the things that were left on the cutting room floor from the Chips and Science bill around this trade title that was eventually taken out. It is still very TBD on whether or not action happens on that, but because you're seeing members like my old boss, Senator Rob Portman, talk about his willingness to act, Senator Portman is traditionally a deal maker and one who is willing to, who has a strong track record of cutting deals. And so because he's in his final act as a U.S. Senator because he's retiring, I think that we could be in a scenario where trade policy, if the stars align, could catch fire and something could happen. I know Michael might be less optimistic than I am because he's an actual expert in these issues, but that's the lens that I'm seeing.
All right, Michael, what do you see over the next until the new Congress comes in?
Yeah, I mean, Ways and Means and Finance, they are certainly trying to pull together a package, just as Darien said. I think in order to get one done, they have to be realistic about what can be included, because a lot of what was in the trade titles of the House and Senate China bills was quite controversial. And so if a package comes together, I think it most likely would be limited to an extension of the GSP program, that's trade preferences for developing countries, MTBs, which provide duty-free treatment for products, inputs to manufacturing that are not made in the United States, and potentially something on trade adjustment assistance, which is difficult because Republicans have always said, if we're going to extend trade adjustment assistance, then we at the same time need to provide trade promotion authority to go out and negotiate new agreements. That's not something that realistically can be negotiated in the lame duck. Perhaps they could go along with more modest adjustments to TAA that was included in the China bill passed by House Democrats, is one possible way forward of compromise. It's that kind of relatively skinny package that if anything comes together, it's likely to be something along those lines.
So let me poke on one thing, because we've got a couple audience questions about this, which is the GSP MTB. When you think that's most likely to happen, and would that be reinstated retroactively?
Yeah. So if I had to bet about whether this package comes together in the lame duck, I bet against. And so that means more likely sometime next year. When they get around to the extension, historically, it always has been retroactive. Now here that has bigger, I guess, budgetary implications than in the past because GSP has been expired since the end of 2020. So likely to be at least almost 2 full years in expiration. But I think, again, if we follow precedent, then I would expect that relief would in fact be retroactive.
Okay, that's helpful. All right, in the interest of time, we're going to flip through a couple of slides, and we're going to just look at what are some of the other things. So we'll go past what the Republicans might do, what Democrats might do, and we're going to get to what might a trade-oriented agenda cover. And I'm going to give each of you, it's a menu. Pick what you like, what's likely to happen, what should happen, what will happen. Michael, why don't you start us off looking at these things? Here's a trade agenda, next 2 years. Hopeful?
Yeah. Okay, so let me start with what I'm most hopeful about. Hopeful in terms of policies that likely will receive support. Here I would say export controls and sanctions. I think there's just a great deal of consensus on these economic security issues, whether we're talking about export controls applied to China or sanctions applied to China in a more limited form, but certainly Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. I expect continued bipartisan congressional support for those policies. On digital trade, I actually think that is likely to move forward as well. There is a little bit of reticence among some Democrats that these agreements in the past have, are too supportive of big tech. But I think many more members kind of see this as a way to help a broad cross-section of U.S. companies that rely on free flows of data and kind of the avoidance of localization measures. So I see that as continuing. Industrial policy, as I said before, I think the Democrats and Republicans have different ideas about exactly what that needs to look like, and certainly Republicans don't support everything that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act, but I don't see that being rolled back, and I see the potential for policy to move forward in other areas, maybe in biotech, maybe in quantum computing, some other things that have built on sort of things that we have done in the current Congress. Let me just take one more, and then I'll turn it over to Darien. I'm going to take nearshoring, friendshoring, TPAs, and FTAs together, because here I think what we've had so far is a lot more rhetoric than policy. So there is this idea that we need to diversify away from China, that we need to rely on allies, that we can't onshore everything that we need, and yet we haven't yet really put in place agreements that influence the activities of private companies to make that happen. And so here I'm going to get back to what I said before. That requires a fairly comprehensive approach to agreements that includes market access, mutual recognition scenarios so that you lower regulatory barriers. I'm a little less optimistic that we'll be able to move forward quickly in this area because it's more politically controversial. But eventually we are going to be required to put some meat on those bones. Right now we have friends in Europe and Japan and Korea who are quite upset about different aspects of the IRA and some of the local content provisions there. That is now the law, but I think the next step for us is to figure out, okay, so what is the affirmative agenda? How are we going to build the supply chains with these and other allies? So let me go ahead and pause there and turn it back to you, Phil.
No, that was good. That was comprehensive. And so, Darien, you're going to get a little short-changed here because time's running short. I want to do one more poll with the audience. But out of these, what's your favorite? What are you looking for?
I would say is that the one that I'll take it from a likelihood, from the lens of one that I think is actually most likely to happen. And I actually would say it's customs modernization legislation. we are up for one of those cycles, right? Customs modernization legislation happens on a particularly like long arc of a cycle that Congress only takes it up really every decade, sometimes every 2 decades. And I actually think that we are coming on the cusp of something around customs modernization could be the only piece of significant trade legislation that actually moves through the Congress and becomes enacted between 2023 and 2025. So I know that's a big prediction, but I actually think that customs modernization out of actually all these things could be one of the things that is actually most likely to happen.
All right, cool, interesting call. All right, we opened with the audience's views. We're going to close with the audience's views. Let's do our last poll just to see where all this discussion has left you. So, given the outcome of the midterms, all of those of you who were with us through the whole thing, what trajectory do you think this sets for U.S. trade policy for the next 2 years? So, your choices: no change, more of the same; less protectionism, for example, trade agreements or tariff lowering; more protectionism, which might be new tariffs or disputes; more active industrial policy, such as subsidies; or a healthy and respectful debate about the U.S.'s proper role in the world economy. I'm so happy that I actually got some of you to vote for that one, which is more than we can say for less protectionism, although there's still time if any of you want to weigh in. So, all right, it looks like the consensus seems to be our strong leader is no change, more of the same. Well, somebody voted for less protectionism. Thank you. All right, gentlemen, closing statements. Darien, why don't I start with you? What do you see in a minute or so? Where are we going? This, and then Michael will get the last word.
Where are we headed? I think that it is still, as we've talked about, a lot of things on trade policy are still TBD. Michael and I have talked about the things that we think could happen, but unfortunately, or just the reality is that there are, like a lot of things in 2022, there are things that have not been on folks' bingo cards that have come to fruition. And so, unfortunately, I think past maybe prologue is that we are going to give you our predictions, but those things, be prepared for deviations from them, just because that's the way that Washington has been, for the past couple of years.
Okay, so we're gonna need another webinar at some point. We haven't. All right, that works. Further research, as we always used to say in academia, calls for further research. Michael, what do you say?
Yeah, I guess I see a little bit of a split screen. I see continuation of kind of the economic security measures that are applied to China, whether export controls, investment reviews, potential outbound investment reviews, sanctions in certain areas. And so I see that continuing to be active and more or less on the same trend line. On the other side of that screen, I see the potential for greater coordination with allies, hopefully on industrial policy. So we fold that in, both in terms of finding areas where we can work together on kind of upstream research and how to really solve some of these difficult problems, but also creating market opportunities among those countries. So that would be my view.
Okay, that's pretty optimistic. Well, listen, thank you both very much, Michael and Darien, for joining us. This is the end of the time that we have, although we haven't run out of interesting things to talk about. We'll have to reconvene. And thank you all to the audience for attending today's session, joining our polls. We will email out the slides and the link to this recording tomorrow morning. There will also be a short feedback survey presented when you log off of this call. So please take a moment to share your thoughts and feedback with the team. We can continue to curate great content for you. Thank you again, and have a great day.